The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Magistrate Helen Morrison adjusted her black robes and prepared for another day of legal proceedings. At 53, she had seen every type of case imaginable, from petty theft to murder trials. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for disruption in her courtroom. The case before her today seemed routine enough. A local businessman named Marcus Reed was facing charges of tax evasion. His expensive lawyer had been arguing technicalities for weeks, trying to get the charges dismissed. The courtroom was half empty, filled mostly with court officials and a few curious onlookers. As Magistrate Morrison called the court to session, she noticed something unusual. A man in an elaborate uniform sat in the back row, his chest decorated with medals and ribbons. He wore a tall hat with a feather, and a ceremonial sword hung at his side. She had never seen anything like it in her 20 years on the bench. The man called himself Captain Edmund Blackwood of the Royal Guard. He claimed to represent the Crown's interests in the case, stating that the defendant had connections to certain royal financial matters. His accent was crisp and authoritative, and he spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Morrison found his presence both puzzling and irritating. There was no royal guard in their jurisdiction. The country had been a republic for over 2 centuries. Yet this man sat there as if he belonged, occasionally making notes and whispering to himself. When the defense attorney began his opening statement, Captain Blackwood suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to these proceedings," he announced, loudly. "This court lacks jurisdiction over matters involving royal finances." The courtroom fell silent. Morrison stared at the man in disbelief. "Excuse me, sir, but who exactly are you and what gives you the right to interrupt these proceedings?" Blackwood straightened his uniform and replied with dignity, "I am Captain Edmund Blackwood, sworn protector of the Crown's interests. This defendant has violated royal tax codes, and therefore this matter should be transferred to the Royal Court of Justice." Morrison felt her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with many unusual characters over the years, but this was beyond anything she had experienced. "Sir, I don't know what game you're playing, but there is no royal court in this jurisdiction. We are a democratic republic. Please take your seat or leave my courtroom." But Blackwood was not deterred. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what appeared to be an official-looking document with ribbons and seals. "Your Honor, I present to you a royal warrant authorizing my presence here today. The Crown has significant financial interests in this case." Morrison examined the document from a distance. It looked elaborate enough with fancy writing and impressive seals, but she wasn't born yesterday. Anyone could create official-looking papers with enough time and creativity. "This is highly irregular," she said firmly. "I've never heard of any royal warrant having authority in this court. Furthermore, your entire presence here is disruptive to these proceedings." As the morning progressed, Blackwood continued to interrupt. Every time the prosecution presented evidence, he would stand and cite various royal precedents and crown privileges. He spoke of ancient laws and treaties that supposedly gave the monarchy authority over certain types of financial crimes. The defendant's lawyer looked confused, but pleased. Any disruption that might delay or complicate his client's case was welcome. The prosecutor, however, grew increasingly frustrated, repeatedly asking Morrison to remove the disruptive individual. Morrison found herself in an unusual position. While Blackwood's claims were clearly nonsense, he wasn't being violent or threatening. He was simply delusional about his authority and the nature of their legal system. She had seen mental illness manifest in many ways over the years, and this seemed like another case of someone living in an alternate reality. During the lunch recess, Morrison asked her court clerk to research whether there were any historical precedents for someone claiming royal authority in their jurisdiction. The clerk, a young man named David who enjoyed legal research, promised to look into it thoroughly. When court resumed after lunch, Blackwood was still there, now with even more documents spread across the table in front of him. He had apparently spent the break preparing additional materials to support his case. "Your Honor," Blackwood said as soon as Morrison took her seat, "I have uncovered additional evidence of this court's obligation to recognize royal authority in this matter. The Treaty of Westmoreland, signed in 1847, clearly establishes "That's enough," Morrison interrupted, her voice echoing through the courtroom. She had reached her limit. "Sir, I have been patient with your disruptions, but this has gone too far. There is no royal guard, no royal court, and no royal authority in this jurisdiction. Your documents appear to be fabrications, and your uniform, while impressive, has no legal standing here." Blackwood looked shocked by her words. He gathered his papers carefully and stood with wounded dignity. "Your Honor, I am disappointed by your refusal to recognize legitimate royal authority. However, I respect the dignity of these proceedings, enough to withdraw temporarily." He paused at the courtroom door and turned back toward Morrison. "But I assure you, Your Honor, I will return with proof that even this court cannot ignore." With that dramatic statement, Captain Edmund Blackwood swept out of the courtroom, his ceremonial sword clanking against his leg as he walked. The room remained silent for several moments after his departure. Morrison shook her head and tried to refocus on the actual case at hand. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let one eccentric individual derail the entire legal process. The tax evasion case against Marcus Reed needed to proceed according to proper legal procedures. But even as she called the court back to order, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last she would see of the mysterious Captain Blackwood. His parting words echoed in her mind, and she wondered what kind of proof he might attempt to present. The afternoon session proceeded without interruption, but Morrison found herself occasionally glancing toward the back of the courtroom, half expecting the elaborate uniform and feathered hat to reappear. When 5 o'clock arrived and court was adjourned for the day, she felt both relief and an odd sense of anticipation. Whatever Captain Blackwood was planning, Morrison was confident that her courtroom could handle it. After all, she had 20 years of experience dealing with unusual situations. How much trouble could one delusional man in a costume really cause? The next morning arrived with an unusual buzz of activity around the courthouse. Word had spread about the previous day's strange interruption, and several court employees had arrived early, curious to see if the mysterious Royal Guard would return as promised. Magistrate Morrison arrived at her usual time, trying to maintain her normal routine despite the anticipation hanging in the air. Her clerk David approached her with a thick folder of research materials he had compiled about historical royal claims and legal precedents. "I spent most of the evening researching this," David said, his voice filled with academic excitement. "There actually were some interesting historical connections to royal authority in our region, but they all ended well before our current legal system was established." Morrison flipped through the research briefly. It was thorough work, but ultimately irrelevant to modern proceedings. "Thank you for the effort, David, but I'm confident that whatever Mr. Blackwood presents today will be nothing more than elaborate fiction." The courtroom filled up more than usual for the resumption of Marcus Reed's tax evasion trial. Word of the previous day's drama had attracted additional spectators, including several local reporters who sensed an interesting human interest story developing. As Morrison called the court to session, she noticed that Captain Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. Part of her felt relieved that perhaps the strange man had reconsidered his delusions overnight. The morning proceeded normally, with the prosecution presenting evidence of Reed's alleged financial irregularities. Around 10:30, just as the prosecutor was explaining complex banking records to the jury, the courtroom doors swung open with more force than necessary. Captain Blackwood strode in, but he was not alone. Behind him walked an elderly woman in elegant clothing, carrying herself with unmistakable dignity despite her advanced age. The woman appeared to be in her 80s, with silver hair perfectly arranged and clothing that suggested both wealth and excellent taste. She walked with a carved wooden cane, but her posture remained straight and commanding. Her eyes surveyed the courtroom with the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of being respected and obeyed. Blackwood had made some changes to his appearance as well. His uniform was even more elaborate than before, with additional ribbons and medals that caught the courtroom lights. He carried a leather portfolio that appeared to be antique, bound with official-looking ribbons and seals. "Your Honor," Blackwood announced in a voice that carried clearly through the now silent courtroom, "I have returned as promised, with both proof of my authority and a witness who can verify the legitimacy of royal claims in this matter." Morrison felt a familiar surge of irritation but also curiosity about the elderly woman who accompanied him. Unlike Blackwood's obvious costume, the woman's presence seemed genuinely dignified and mysterious. "Sir, I thought I made it clear yesterday that your interruptions are not welcome in this courtroom," Morrison said firmly. "Whatever documents you believe you have, they cannot change the fundamental fact that we operate under Republican law, not royal authority." The elderly woman stepped forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and cultured with hints of an accent that was difficult to place. "Your Honor, may I request permission to address the court? I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding that I can help to clarify." Morrison found herself intrigued despite her better judgment. The woman's manner was so different from Blackwood's theatrical approach that she seemed worthy of at least a brief hearing. "You have 2 minutes," Morrison said carefully. "But I warn you that any disruption of these proceedings will result in both of you being removed from the courtroom." The woman nodded graciously and opened an elegant handbag, removing what appeared to be very old documents in protective covers. "Your Honor, my name is Lady Catherine Whitmore. Captain Blackwood contacted me yesterday because he believed I might have information relevant to certain historical claims being made in this case." She approached the bench with slow, dignified steps. "These documents have been in my family's possession for over 150 years. They relate to financial agreements made between my ancestor and representatives of the former royal government of this region." Morrison accepted the documents cautiously. They appeared genuinely old, with yellowed paper and faded ink that would be difficult to fake convincingly. The writing was in an ornate style typical of the 19th century, and the legal language was complex and formal. "Lady Whitmore," Morrison said after examining the first few pages, "these documents are certainly interesting from a historical perspective, but they cannot possibly have any bearing on modern legal proceedings. Whatever agreements existed in the past, they were superseded when our current government was established." Lady Whitmore smiled politely, but persistent. "I understand Your Honor's position, but there is one particular clause that was never formally dissolved. My ancestor, Lord James Whitmore, served as a financial agent for the royal government. According to these documents, certain types of tax disputes involving properties that were once under royal management were to be handled according to specific protocols." Blackwood stepped forward eagerly. "Exactly what I've been trying to explain, Your Honor. The defendant's business operates from a building that was once part of the Royal Administrative Complex. These historical obligations were never formally terminated." Morrison looked more carefully at the documents. While she remained skeptical about their modern relevance, she had to admit that they appeared to be authentic historical artifacts. The legal language was consistent with 19th century practices, and the physical condition of the papers suggested genuine age. The prosecutor, who had been listening with growing impatience, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, with respect to these historical documents, they cannot possibly supersede current tax law. Mr. Reed is charged under contemporary statutes, not 19th century royal regulations." Lady Whitmore turned toward the prosecutor with a patient expression. "Young man, that would ordinarily be correct. However, there is a concept in law known as unresolved historical obligations. When previous legal systems are replaced, certain specific agreements may remain binding if they were never formally dissolved through proper legal channels." Morrison felt herself being drawn into a legal puzzle that was far more complex than she had initially realized. While she still doubted that these historical claims could affect the current case, the documents appeared authentic enough to warrant serious consideration. "Lady Whitmore," Morrison said carefully, "these are certainly fascinating historical documents. However, I would need to see compelling evidence that any of these old agreements were specifically preserved when our current legal system was established." Lady Whitmore exchanged a meaningful look with Captain Blackwood before responding. "That evidence exists, Your Honor, but it requires access to certain archived records that are not easily obtained. With the court's permission, Captain Blackwood, and I would like to request a brief recess to gather additional documentation." Morrison found herself in an unusual situation. While her instinct was to dismiss these historical claims as irrelevant, the documents appeared genuine enough that she felt obligated to allow proper investigation. The last thing she wanted was to have a conviction overturned later because she had failed to consider relevant legal precedents no matter how unusual. "I'm willing to grant a recess until tomorrow morning," Morrison said finally. "But I want to be absolutely clear that any additional documents you present must be verified by qualified experts. I will not accept elaborate fabrications no matter how convincing they appear." Captain Blackwood bowed formally. "Thank you, Your Honor. I assure you that tomorrow's evidence will be beyond question." As the courtroom emptied, Morrison remained at the bench, studying the documents Lady Whitmore had provided. They were either genuine historical artifacts or incredibly sophisticated forgeries. Either way, tomorrow's session promised to be unlike anything in her 20 years of judicial experience. That evening, Magistrate Morrison found herself unable to concentrate on anything other than the mysterious documents Lady Whitmore had presented. She had taken them home for private examination, something she rarely did with court materials. The more she studied them, the more convinced she became that they were genuine historical artifacts. The legal language was consistent with 19th century practices, and the physical condition of the papers showed signs of authentic aging that would be extremely difficult to fake. The watermarks matched patterns used during the appropriate time period, and even the ink appeared to have faded naturally over many decades. Morrison called her old law professor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who specialized in legal history. Dr. May. Hartwell agreed to examine digital photographs of the documents that evening. Her response came back within 2 hours, and it was more intriguing than Morrison had expected. "Helen, these documents appear to be authentic," Dr. Hartwell wrote in her email. "The legal language is consistent with the period, and I recognize several specific phrases that were commonly used in royal financial agreements of that era. However, the really interesting part is the clause about unresolved obligations. That type of language was actually used to preserve certain agreements when governments changed." Morrison read the email twice, feeling a growing sense that this case was becoming far more complicated than a simple tax evasion trial. She had always prided herself on running an orderly courtroom, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this situation. The next morning brought an even larger crowd to the courthouse. Word had spread through the community about the mysterious royal claims, and the local newspaper had run a front-page story titled "Royal Drama Comes to Local Court." Morrison arrived to find camera crews from 2 television stations setting up outside the building. David, her clerk, approached with obvious excitement. "Your Honor, I've been contacted by 3 different historical societies this morning. They're all interested in examining the documents from yesterday. Apparently, word has gotten out about potential royal artifacts being discovered." Morrison felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. What had started as a routine tax case was becoming a media sensation. She instructed David to keep all reporters and historians out of the courtroom until the legal proceedings were completed. When court convened, Captain Blackwood and Lady Whitmore were already seated in the front row with several boxes of materials arranged on the table before them. Blackwood's uniform was, if possible, even more elaborate than before, and he carried what appeared to be an antique ceremonial sword in a decorated scabbard. Lady Whitmore was dressed in formal black clothing with a string of pearls that looked genuinely expensive. She carried a large leather briefcase that appeared to be quite old, with brass corners and elaborate lock mechanisms. "Your Honor," Blackwood announced as soon as Morrison called the court to session, "we have obtained the additional documentation you requested. I believe you will find it quite compelling." Morrison nodded cautiously. "Before we proceed, I want it understood that any documents you present will be subject to expert examination. I have already consulted with a legal historian about yesterday's materials." Lady Whitmore smiled approvingly. "That was very wise, Your Honor. We would expect nothing less than thorough verification of such important historical claims." She opened her briefcase and removed a series of documents, each protected in clear archival covers. "These materials come from the personal archives of my family, as well as from certain official repositories that Captain Blackwood was able to access through his historical research connections." Blackwood stepped forward with formal ceremony. "Your Honor, what we present today is not merely historical curiosity. but active legal documentation that directly affects the jurisdiction of this court in the present case. The first document Lady Whitmore presented was titled Articles of Continuity and dated 1823. According to the ornate legal language, it established procedures for maintaining certain royal financial obligations even if the political system changed. This document, Lady Whitmore explained, was created specifically to ensure that certain financial agreements would remain binding regardless of changes in government. It was signed by representatives of both the royal administration and the emerging Republican leadership. Morrison examined the document carefully. Unlike typical historical artifacts that had only academic interest, this one included specific legal language about tax collection and financial oversight that seemed remarkably relevant to contemporary issues. The second document was even more surprising. It was a detailed property survey from 1829 that identified specific buildings and land parcels that remained subject to continuing royal financial oversight. The address of Marcus Reed's business was clearly listed among the affected properties. "This cannot be correct," the prosecutor interrupted, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're claiming that a property tax case from today is somehow governed by laws from 200 years ago?" Captain Blackwood responded with dignity. "Not governed by old laws, but subject to unresolved legal obligations that were specifically preserved when the political transition occurred. These are not ancient laws being applied to modern situations, but continuous legal obligations that were never properly dissolved." Lady Whitmore presented the third document, which was perhaps the most remarkable of all. It was a letter dated 1831, written by the first Republican Attorney General, acknowledging the validity of the continuity agreements and confirming that certain financial oversight responsibilities would be maintained by designated royal representatives in perpetuity or until formally dissolved by mutual agreement. Morrison felt as though she was being drawn into a legal labyrinth unlike anything she had ever encountered. The documents appeared authentic, the legal language was consistent, and the historical context seemed plausible. Yet the implications were extraordinary. "Lady Whitmore," Morrison said carefully, "assuming these documents are authentic, what exactly are you and Captain Blackwood claiming? That this court lacks jurisdiction over the current tax case?" Lady Whitmore exchanged a look with Blackwood before responding. "Not that the court lacks jurisdiction, Your Honor, but that certain additional legal procedures must be followed. According to these preserved agreements, cases involving properties under continuing royal financial oversight must include a representative of the royal interests as a formal party to the proceedings." Blackwood stepped forward eagerly. "Which is exactly why my presence here is not merely ceremonial, but legally required. I serve as the designated representative of those historical royal financial interests." The defendant's lawyer, who had been quietly observing these developments, suddenly spoke up with obvious excitement. "Your Honor, if these historical obligations are legally binding, then my client's case has been proceeding without proper jurisdiction. The charges should be dismissed until the proper legal procedures are followed." Morrison felt a headache beginning to develop. She was facing a legal situation that no law school had prepared her for, with apparently authentic historical documents that seemed to create genuine procedural complications for a routine tax case. The prosecutor was clearly frustrated. "Your Honor, with all respect to these historical documents, we cannot allow every criminal case to be derailed by claims about centuries-old agreements. There must be reasonable limits to how far back we dig into historical legal complications." Morrison realized she needed expert assistance beyond her own knowledge and experience. "I am going to order a recess until next week," she announced. "During that time, I want these documents examined by qualified historians and legal experts. I also want both sides to prepare detailed briefs about the potential modern applications of these historical agreements." As the courtroom emptied, Morrison remained at the bench staring at the documents spread before her. Either she was witnessing an elaborate fraud, or she was about to become part of one of the most unusual legal cases in the history of the court system. Captain Blackwood approached the bench one final time before leaving. "Your Honor, I appreciate your careful consideration of these matters. The truth has a way of emerging regardless of how deeply it has been buried by time. The week-long recess became the most intensive legal research period in the history of the local courthouse. Morrison had arranged for 3 different experts to examine the documents: Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell for legal history, Dr. Michael Chen from the State University's History Department for document authentication, and forensics expert Dr. Sarah Martinez for physical analysis of the paper and ink. Meanwhile, news of the case had spread far beyond the local community. Legal scholars from across the country were following the developments, and several universities had requested copies of the documents for academic study. The courthouse had been forced to hire additional security to manage the crowds of reporters and curious onlookers. Captain Blackwood had spent the week at the local historical society, which had given him access to their archives and research facilities. Lady Whitmore had returned to her family estate to gather additional materials that might support their claims. Both had promised to present even more compelling evidence when court resumed. On Monday morning, Morrison arrived at the courthouse to find organized chaos. Television trucks lined the street, reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, and a small group of history enthusiasts had set up camp outside the building with signs reading, "Preserve Historical Justice," and "Royal Rights Matter." Dr. Hartwell was waiting in Morrison's chambers with her analysis. "Helen, I have to admit that these documents have completely changed my understanding of the legal transition period in your region. The continuity agreements are not only authentic, they represent a sophisticated attempt to preserve certain legal obligations across political systems." She spread out several reference books and academic papers on Morrison's desk. "I've found similar agreements in other regions that experienced transitions from monarchical to republican government. The legal concept is sound, and the documentation appears to be legitimate." Dr. Chen's analysis was equally compelling. "The documents are definitely authentic 19th century artifacts. The paper, ink, watermarks, and aging patterns are all consistent with the claimed dates. These are not modern forgeries." Dr. Martinez's forensic report was the most detailed of all. She had used advanced techniques to analyze every aspect of the document's physical composition. "I found no evidence of artificial aging or modern materials. The chemical composition of the ink matches samples from the appropriate time period, and the paper shows natural deterioration patterns that would be impossible to fake convincingly." Morrison felt both vindicated and concerned. The documents were clearly authentic, but their legal implications remained unclear. She had requested additional research from the State Attorney General's office, but their response had been limited to expressing interest in observing the proceedings. When court convened, the public gallery was completely packed, with additional observers standing along the walls. Morrison had never seen so many people crammed into her courtroom, and she worried about maintaining proper order during what promised to be unusual proceedings. Captain Blackwood entered wearing what appeared to be an entirely different uniform, even more elaborate than his previous outfits. This one included a ceremonial sash covered with medals, and he carried both a sword and what appeared to be an official staff of office, topped with an ornate silver head. Lady Whitmore accompanied him, dressed in formal court attire that would have been appropriate for royal ceremonies 2 centuries earlier. She carried an antique leather case that looked as though it might contain official documents or ceremonial items. "Your Honor," Blackwood announced with formal ceremony, "we are prepared to present the final and conclusive evidence of our legitimate authority in these proceedings. With your permission, Lady Whitmore will present materials that establish not only the historical validity of our claims, but their continuing legal force." Morrison nodded cautiously. The week of expert analysis had convinced her that she was dealing with genuine historical artifacts, but she remained skeptical about their modern legal applications. Lady Whitmore opened her antique case and removed a document that was clearly older and more elaborate than anything she had presented previously. It was written on parchment rather than paper, with an ornate border decorated in gold leaf, and sealed with what appeared to be genuine wax seals bearing complex coat of arms designs. "Your Honor," Lady Whitmore said with quiet dignity, "this is the Master Charter of Continuing Royal Financial Authority, dated 1798. It establishes the fundamental legal framework that governs all subsequent agreements and obligations related to royal financial interests in this region. Morrison accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly. It was clearly an artifact of considerable historical importance, regardless of its legal implications. The parchment felt genuinely old, and the elaborate decoration suggested that it had been created as an official document of great significance. The charter was written in formal legal language that was even more complex than the previous documents. It established detailed procedures for maintaining royal financial oversight, even in the event of political changes, and it specifically authorized the appointment of continuing royal representatives who would serve until such time as all obligations are formally dissolved. Captain Blackwood stepped forward with obvious pride. Your Honor, this charter establishes the legal framework that authorizes my service as a continuing royal representative. My authority does not derive from any current government, but from historical legal obligations that remain binding. The prosecutor had clearly reached his limit of patience. Your Honor, even if these documents are authentic historical artifacts, they cannot possibly override 2 centuries of subsequent legal development. We cannot allow our entire legal system to be held hostage by ancient agreements. Lady Whitmore responded with calm authority. With respect, the issue is not whether ancient agreements can override modern law, but whether specific legal obligations were properly dissolved when the political system changed. These documents demonstrate that certain obligations were specifically preserved through proper legal procedures. Morrison studied the charter carefully, trying to understand its implications. The legal language was sophisticated and specific, clearly written by people who understood the complexities of preserving legal obligations across political transitions. Lady Whitmore, Morrison said finally, this charter is certainly an impressive historical document. However, I need to understand exactly what practical effects you believe it should have on current legal proceedings, Captain Blackwood answered, before Lady Whitmore could respond. Your Honor, the charter establishes that cases involving properties subject to continuing royal financial oversight must include a royal representative as a formal party to the proceedings. Without my proper recognition as such a representative, this court lacks complete jurisdiction over the current case. The defendant's lawyer was practically bouncing in his seat with excitement. Your Honor, this means my client's case has been proceeding under incomplete jurisdiction. The charges should be dismissed until proper procedures are followed. Morrison felt as though she was standing at a crossroads between historical obligation and modern legal practice. The documents appeared authentic, the legal arguments were sophisticated, and the historical research supported the claims being made. Yet the practical implications were extraordinary. I need time to consider the full implications of these materials, Morrison announced. Court will recess until tomorrow morning, at which time I will render my decision on how these historical claims affect the current proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, Morrison remained at the bench, staring at the ancient charter spread before her. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether Captain Edmund Blackwood was a delusional man in a costume or the legitimate representative of legal obligations that had survived for over 2 centuries. That evening, Magistrate Morrison sat in her study surrounded by law books, historical documents, and expert reports. She had canceled her dinner plans and asked her family not to disturb her while she wrestled with the most challenging legal decision of her career. The phone had been ringing constantly with calls from legal scholars, reporters, and even government officials who had heard about the case. The State Attorney General's office had sent a representative to observe the proceedings, and law schools from 3 different universities had requested permission to use the case as a teaching example. Morrison's biggest concern was not the media attention or academic interest, but the fundamental question of whether she was about to make legal history or become the subject of ridicule for falling victim to an elaborate hoax. Despite all the expert analysis confirming the authenticity of the documents, part of her still wondered if she was being manipulated by sophisticated con artists. She called Dr. Hartwell one more time to discuss the legal implications. Elizabeth, I need your honest assessment. If these documents are authentic and the legal arguments are sound, do I have any choice but to recognize Blackwood's claims? Dr. Hartwell's response was thoughtful but troubling. Helen, based on my research, the legal framework these documents establish appears to be binding under the doctrine of continuing legal obligations. If the historical agreements were never properly dissolved, they may indeed create enforceable rights that survive political changes. Morrison spent hours reading every relevant legal precedent she could find. Cases involving unresolved historical obligations were rare, but they did exist. Courts had occasionally been forced to recognize property rights, financial obligations, and even governmental responsibilities that had survived from previous legal systems. The next morning brought an even larger crowd to the courthouse. News organizations from major cities had sent reporters, and legal experts were providing commentary on television and radio programs. The courthouse steps were packed with observers holding signs supporting various positions on the case. When Morrison entered her courtroom, she found it filled to capacity with the most diverse audience she had ever seen. There were legal scholars taking notes, reporters with cameras, history enthusiasts with recording devices, and curious citizens who simply wanted to witness what had become known as the Royal Guard case. Captain Blackwood and Lady Whitmore were seated at a table that had been specially arranged for them, with their historical documents displayed in protective covers. Blackwood wore what appeared to be his most formal uniform yet, complete with a ceremonial cape and an ornate sword that caught the courtroom lights. Morrison called the court to order and waited for complete silence before speaking. The decision she was about to announce would affect not only this case but potentially establish precedents for how historical legal obligations are handled in modern courts. After extensive consultation with experts in legal history, document authentication, and forensic analysis, I have determined that the documents presented by Captain Blackwood and Lady Whitmore are authentic historical artifacts from the early 19th century, she began. A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Morrison continued without pausing. Furthermore, the legal arguments presented regarding continuing royal financial obligations appear to be based on legitimate historical agreements that were properly executed according to the legal standards of their time. The prosecutor looked increasingly worried, while the defendant's lawyer was clearly trying to control his excitement about the potential implications for his client's case. However, Morrison continued, the question before this court is not whether these historical obligations existed, but whether they remain legally binding in contemporary proceedings. This requires careful consideration of how legal systems evolve and how historical obligations are preserved or dissolved over time. Captain Blackwood stood up formally. Your Honor, may I respectfully request permission to present one final piece of evidence that directly addresses this question? Morrison nodded, curious about what additional materials could possibly be more compelling than what had already been presented. Lady Whitmore opened a small wooden box that had been sitting on their table. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was what appeared to be an official seal made of silver and bearing an intricate coat of arms design. Accompanying it was a letter written on official government letterhead from 1847. This letter, Lady Whitmore explained, was written by the state's first Attorney General 24 years after the political transition. It explicitly acknowledges the continuing validity of royal financial oversight obligations and confirms the appointment of royal representatives to fulfill these responsibilities. Morrison examined the letter carefully. It was written on official government stationery and signed with what appeared to be an authentic signature. The letter specifically referenced the charter and continuity agreements that had been presented earlier, and it confirmed that certain royal financial obligations would continue in perpetuity under the oversight of designated representatives. Captain Blackwood stepped forward with ceremonial dignity. Your Honor, this letter establishes that the new Republican government officially recognized and confirmed the continuing validity of these obligations. This is not a case of ancient laws being applied to modern situations, but of continuous legal responsibilities that were officially preserved through proper governmental procedures. Morrison felt the weight of legal history settling on her shoulders. The evidence was compelling, the legal arguments were sophisticated, and the historical documentation appeared to be complete and authentic. She was facing a situation where the normal rules of legal precedent led to an extraordinary conclusion. "Captain Blackwood," she said carefully, "if I were to recognize your claims, what specific authority are you requesting this court to acknowledge?" Blackwood's response was precise and formal. "Your Honor, I request recognition as the designated royal representative for cases involving properties subject to continuing financial oversight obligations. This would require my formal participation in proceedings as a party, with standing to represent these historical interests." The implications were staggering. Morrison would be acknowledging that a man dressed as a royal guard had legitimate legal authority derived from 2-century-old agreements that had somehow survived multiple changes in government and legal systems. Yet, the evidence supporting his claims was more comprehensive and convincing than documentation presented in many routine cases that passed through her courtroom every day. Morrison took a deep breath and made her decision. Based on the historical evidence presented, the expert analysis confirming the authenticity of the documents, and the legal precedents regarding continuing obligations across political transitions, this court recognizes Captain Edmund Blackwood as the designated representative of continuing royal financial interests in this jurisdiction. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs and excited conversations. Reporters were frantically taking notes, legal observers were conferring in whispered discussions, and photographers were capturing what they knew would be historic images. Morrison continued over the noise. However, this recognition comes with specific limitations and requirements. Captain Blackwood's authority is limited to cases involving properties specifically identified in the historical agreements. His participation in proceedings must follow standard legal protocols, and his actions are subject to the same rules of evidence and procedure that govern other parties. Captain Blackwood bowed formally. "Your Honor, I accept these conditions and pledge to fulfill my responsibilities with the dignity and respect that these historical obligations deserve." The prosecutor stood up with obvious frustration. "Your Honor, I must respectfully object to this unprecedented recognition of historical claims. The implications for our entire legal system could be enormous." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Your objection is noted and understood. However, the law requires us to recognize legitimate legal obligations, regardless of how unusual or inconvenient they might be. The evidence presented establishes that these particular obligations were properly preserved through legal channels." Lady Whitmore gathered her documents with obvious satisfaction. "Your Honor, Captain Blackwood and I are grateful for the court's careful consideration of these important historical matters. Justice has been served by recognizing obligations that have been maintained faithfully for over 2 centuries. As the session ended, Morrison realized that she had just made legal history. News of her decision would spread throughout the legal community, and law schools would undoubtedly study this case for years to come. Whether she would be remembered as a wise judge who recognized important historical obligations, or as someone who fell victim to an elaborate historical fraud, remained to be seen. Captain Blackwood approached the bench one final time before leaving. "Your Honor, I want to express my appreciation for your willingness to consider evidence that many courts might have dismissed without proper examination. The truth has indeed emerged, as I promised it would." 3 weeks after Magistrate Morrison's historic decision, the full implications of recognizing Captain Blackwood's authority were still unfolding. The case had attracted national attention from legal scholars, historians, and government officials, who were trying to understand how 2-century-old agreements could suddenly become relevant in modern courtrooms. The tax evasion case against Marcus Reed had been suspended pending a complete review of the historical obligations affecting his property. Captain Blackwood, now formally recognized as a party to the proceedings, had requested access to all financial records related to properties covered by the royal oversight agreements. Morrison had established special procedures for handling cases involving historical obligations. Captain Blackwood was required to file formal legal briefs, present evidence according to standard rules, and participate in proceedings through a licensed attorney who could navigate modern legal procedures on his behalf. The attorney Blackwood had chosen was Sarah Williams, a young lawyer who specialized in unusual historical legal cases. She had been fascinated by the opportunity to represent a client whose authority derived from 19th-century royal appointments. Working with Captain Blackwood has been the most interesting experience of my legal career, Williams told reporters, outside the courthouse. His knowledge of historical legal procedures is remarkable, and his commitment to fulfilling these inherited responsibilities is genuinely impressive. Lady Whitmore had returned to her family estate, but she remained available as a consultant on historical matters. She had donated copies of all the relevant documents to the State Historical Society, which was planning a major exhibition about the legal transition period in the region. The academic community had embraced the case as a unique example of how legal systems preserve certain obligations across political changes. Law schools were using the case materials to teach students about the complexities of legal continuity and historical precedents. Dr. Hartwell had published several academic papers about the case, establishing herself as a leading expert on continuing legal obligations. The Blackwood case demonstrates that our legal system is more flexible and historically aware than many people realize, she wrote in the Harvard Law Review. However, not everyone was pleased with Morrison's decision. The State Attorney General's office had expressed concerns about the precedent established by recognizing historical claims that had been dormant for centuries. They worried that other individuals might emerge with similar claims based on ancient agreements. Morrison had received both praise and criticism for her handling of the case. Some legal commentators applauded her careful consideration of historical evidence, while others argued that she had opened the door to endless complications from people claiming authority based on obsolete agreements. The most surprising development came when Captain Blackwood's investigation of Marcus Reed's financial records revealed information that none of the modern investigators had discovered. Using historical knowledge of how royal financial oversight had operated, he found evidence of tax avoidance strategies that were technically legal under current law, but violated the spirit of the historical oversight obligations. Captain Blackwood's analysis has been remarkably thorough, Prosecutor James Mitchell admitted reluctantly. His understanding of historical financial practices has helped us identify patterns that we missed using conventional investigative methods. Reed's defense attorney was less enthusiastic about Blackwood's involvement. Having a party to legal proceedings whose authority derives from 200-year-old royal appointments creates complications that our legal system was never designed to handle, he complained to reporters. But perhaps the most significant impact of the case was its effect on Captain Blackwood himself. Recognition by the court had transformed him from someone people considered eccentric or delusional into a legitimate legal figure whose historical knowledge had practical value. I have spent 20 years researching these historical obligations, Blackwood explained in an interview with a legal journal. Being finally recognized by the court system as the legitimate heir to these responsibilities has been deeply gratifying. Lady Whitmore expressed similar satisfaction with the outcome. My family has preserved these documents for over a century, waiting for the right time to present them. Captain Blackwood's dedication to historical accuracy made it possible to finally establish their legal significance. Morrison continued to receive requests from courts in other jurisdictions asking for guidance on how to handle similar historical claims. Her careful procedures for evaluating and recognizing continuing legal obligations were being studied as a potential model for other courts. The case had also attracted international attention from legal systems that had experienced similar transitions, from monarchical to republican government. Scholars from several countries were studying the documentation to see if similar unresolved obligations might exist in their legal systems. 6 months after the initial confrontation, Morrison reflected on how the case had changed her understanding of the law. I learned that our legal system is built on historical foundations that are more complex and durable than we usually recognize, she told a gathering of judges. Sometimes our responsibility is to acknowledge those foundations, even when they lead to unexpected conclusions. Captain Blackwood had established an office in the courthouse basement, where he continued his research into other properties that might be subject to historical oversight obligations. He wore his uniform to court appearances, but had adopted more conventional clothing for his daily research activities. The tax case against Marcus Reed was eventually resolved with a plea agreement that took into account both modern tax law and the historical oversight obligations that Blackwood represented. Reed paid substantial penalties but avoided jail time, and his business was required to submit to ongoing financial monitoring that combined contemporary accounting standards with historical oversight procedures. Morrison's decision had established legal precedent that continuing obligations from previous legal systems could be recognized if they were properly documented and had been officially preserved through appropriate governmental procedures. Law schools now taught the Blackwood Doctrine as an example of how courts should handle complex historical legal claims. The case became a landmark example of how careful legal analysis could reveal hidden connections between historical and contemporary law. It demonstrated that dismissing unusual claims without proper investigation could mean overlooking legitimate legal rights that had been preserved across centuries of political and social change. As Morrison concluded in her final written opinion on the case, the law is not merely a contemporary creation but a continuing conversation between past and present. Our responsibility as legal officers is to ensure that this conversation acknowledges all legitimate voices, regardless of how unexpected or unusual they might initially appear.